Perhaps the most widely asked and celebrated question on Parashat Naso pertains to the repetition of the Korbanot Ha-Nesi'im that occurs at the end of the Parsha. At the very end of Parashat Naso, the Mishkan is completed. 12 Nesi'im, the respective leaders of the 12 Shevatim, each decide to bring an identical korban on 12 consecutive days. And instead of the Torah simply recording the nature of that korban and telling us that Nesi'im did indeed bring it on 12 consecutive days, the Torah instead decides to record the korban 12 separate times, making Parashat Naso the longest sidra in the Torah, and leaving us baffled as to why the Torah, which is ordinarily reserved in its prose and only tells us what we need to know, decides to almost gratuitously repeat the korban over and over again. Of course, the question as to why the Korbanos Ha-Nesi'im are repeated obscures another question, which pertains not to the way the Torah records the Korbanos of the Nesi'im, but rather to the phenomenon itself. In other words, instead of asking why the Torah repeats the korban, we could also simply raise the question as to why the Nesi'im decided in the first place to bring an identical korban 12 days in a row. The world of Avodas HaMishkan, of Avodas HaMikdash, is one that is often quite regimented. There's not much room for personal expression or creativity. The Torah and the Halacha have very strict guidelines on what is supposed to be done, how it's supposed to be done, when it's supposed to be done, by whom it is supposed to be done, what thoughts one should be thinking when one engages in the Avodas HaMishkan. And here the Nesi'im were presented a golden opportunity to actually engage in some form of personal expression, to be creative, come up with some kind of korban that is expressive of the unique character, general and spiritual character of their Shevet. And yet they decide to almost squander the opportunity and bring an identical korban 12 times over. And of course, while there could be many approaches as to why the Torah records this so many times, as to why the Nesi'im decide to bring identical korbanos, there's one Midrash in BaMidbar Rabba, Parashat Yud Gimel Siman Yud Dalet, that I've always found powerful on these Korbanos Ha-Nesi'im. Midrash records that while it is true that they all brought the same korban, even though they all brought a single korban, the Midrash goes on to say, each person brought that korban in accordance with his own perception, his own personal interpretation and meaning of what the korban meant. And the Midrash goes on to describe how each Nasi brought that korban, how Shevet Yehuda begins, and Nachshon ben Aminadav, the Nasi of Shevet Yehuda, finds symbolism of Malchus, of kingship, which of course is associated with Shevet Yehuda in the korban. How Yisachar comes along and finds different symbolisms for Torah. Each Shevet takes that same identical korban, and even though outwardly they are indeed identical, they all consist of the same components, each one finds personal meaning that is expressive indeed of the unique character of their Shevet in that korban. And I think when viewed from that light, when viewed from the perspective of the Midrash, the Korbanos of the Nesi'im are actually reflective of a certain tension that I think is central to Torah life. It's one that Rabbi Zatzal used to speak about, between our fealty to the totality of Torah life and halacha, even in moments when on a personal level it might feel uniform or redundant, and seeking within that system to find personal expression and personal meaning as we seek to forge our own spiritual personality. Rabbi Zatzal highlighted this message in another passage pertaining to the Shevatim, when Yaakov Avinu gives his bracha to his sons at the very end of his life in Bereshis Perek Mem Tes, at the end of Parshas Vayechi. Rashi comments on Pasuk Yirches, Kol Eila Shetei Yisrael Shnei Masar V'Zos Asher Diber Lahem Avihem Vayevarach Osam Ish Asher Kivrchaso Berach Osam. Rashi says that even though each Shevet was given a particular unique bracha, they were all included in the brachos of everyone else. And Rav Zatzal argued that it's reflective of how even though each one represented a personal, particular spiritual character trait, particular spiritual midah, they were all bound by the totality of the spiritual traits described collectively for all of them. And we find this in many areas of particular religious life. When it comes to Talmud Torah, on the one hand, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, Perek Hey, Mishnah Chaf Aleph, gives us a very strict regimen over what we're supposed to be learning at different ages. It's a description of our mitzvah to master Kol HaTorah Kula, all of Torah. The Gemara Kiddushin on Daf Lamed tells us how we're supposed to structure our day in terms of what we're supposed to be learning when. And yet at the same time, the Gemara Avodah Zarah on Daf Yotes famously tells us, the Olam Yilmod Adam Torah b'makom sheli bo chafetz, that, as Rashi explains, one should find a particular area of Torah that speaks to you, that resonates with you. When it comes to tefillah, when it comes to prayer, we have all sorts of halachos regarding that we're not supposed to deviate from the formal, strict liturgy that the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah have established for us, and how it's inappropriate to freelance when it comes to crafting and structuring tefillos. And yet, at the same time, the Gemara in Brachos and Daf Chavtes tells us that we're not supposed to make tefillah kava. And what does it mean when we're not supposed to make tefillah kava? The Gemara cites different opinions. Rabbi Rav Yosef to Amri Charvayu, Kol she'enu yochol lachadesh badavar. That in our tefillos, we're supposed to add something new. We're even as we maintain that structured liturgy that the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah have established for us, we're supposed to find something that we can add, some area where we can add personal expression to our tefillah, find personal meaning in the tefillos that we recite. We're supposed to find room for that personal initiative and creativity as well. And that's no easy task. It requires a lot of introspection, honest self-examination, finding our chilek within Torah. But when we are able to do that, when we're able to observe the totality of Torah and Halacha, but at the same time, find our unique niche, find the unique expression for our spiritual persona, for our spiritual personality, we add a layer of depth and meaning that dramatically enhances our Avodas Hashem. Wishing everyone a wonderful Shabbos.